if you're going to have polling companies aided by the media repeating these polls and kind of, assaulting South Africans with this news day in and day out. So I think the Northern Cape is particularly going to shock people. And what's interesting about it is the big discussions around KZN and Gauteng, understandably. But, with the Northern Cape and the strong possibility that the ANC loses a majority, taps of patronage and networks and jobs get turned off. I mean, it really does wither on the vine.
The last stretch to the general election is here. We are wrapping up with some of the people whose journeys we've been following throughout the election campaign. And one of our regular guests on the State of the Nation has been Michael Beaumont, Chairman of Action SA. Michael, welcome to the State of the Nation again. It's been a while.
Yeah, always good to be here in the studio with you.
Yeah, and we remember Pace Car Rental. They the oaks that keep us on the air. If you need to rent a car, Pace Car Rental are the people, and you can get our special secret discount if you just use the code SONA when you book online and get your car anywhere and help support the State of the Nation channel. So that's been really good. We managed to get most of the parties here, and Action SA are one of the options for the election. And just to gauge the last minute temperature, Mike, tell us, Action SA, right? You guys have built up a hell of an infrastructure. We've had many of your members here on the State of the Nation, Herman, when your manifesto came out. But now it's been campaigning season. How's it going?
Yeah, excellent. You talk about the temperature. It's hot in the kitchen. We really have been able to deliver a campaign very decisively across 9 provinces. And I think what really sets Action SA apart and the feedback we're getting from the South African people is that Action SA is new enough that it's not lumped in with a failed establishment that has presided over the current position of our country over the last 30 years. But we also tested as a new political party, having stood in 2021 and become the 6th largest party in South Africa, despite only standing in 6 municipalities, and having leaders like Herman Mashaba and Athol Trollip with a very credible track record in governing. Those features of Action SA have set us apart from other new parties that are relatively untested, and I think South Africans continue to be fairly skeptical of brand new political parties that are unmeasured and untested because they've been let down before.
Now, there's one group of people that you can't seem to impress, and that's the pollsters, right? And I know you have had a particular say on the matter when it comes to polling, but it's fair to say that the polls seem to be ignoring you, lumping you together in the others category. It doesn't represent your performance in 2021. So either what happened in 2021 won't be replicated, or there's something wrong with the polls, or something is there.
Okay, well, let's start going back to 2021. In 2021, the polls had us at around 20 or 30% of what we ended up getting, because just by the nature of polls is that they battle to measure newer political parties. And while we have contested in one election, it was only in 6 municipalities, and in the majority of the 9 provinces, voters will be seeing Action SA on the ballot for the first time. And I think the polls will always undercount us in that regard, and we think they're doing it again now. We think there's another dynamic that is making polling almost impossible in South Africa, even good polling, and that is that at this late stage in the election, most South Africans are still undecided. I think it is probably the defining feature of this election more than any other, that people will wake up on the morning of the election in considerable numbers and not be sure who they're voting for. And even people who've made up their minds are going to be open to changing their minds because, quite frankly, the established political parties lack a strong affinity in the minds of many of the voters who may vote for them. So from an Action SA standpoint, we aren't concerned by these things. We think these polls are greatly undermeasuring us. But also we got to start having a conversation about the unregulated polling industry in South Africa. If you look at countries like France and Brazil and Canada, they actually require polling companies to register with their electoral courts or commissions and to publish information relating to their methodology. In South Africa, we've got nothing. So if you've got an organization like the SRF that is producing polls by Victory Research, whose managing director and founding partner is the currently employed DA head of research. If he produces bad polling for SRF, I'm not sure if that's going to be an issue on Monday morning when he goes into the office. And at the same time, we've had to go to the press council about Report and other media outlets that have published polls anonymously, withholding information from South Africans in terms of who did those polls and what their provenance was, only to find out later that they were indeed commissioned by a political party. So I think there's a problem in polling in South Africa, but the one thing I will always live with great comfort in the idea of is that the only polls that matter are the ones that the people are going to be casting their votes in on the election day next week.
Let's just to sort of talk this polling issue over here. I understand the importance of regulation, and the importance of regulation is that the polls may in fact potentially influence voters, because you may get the sense that a party over there and you don't see them reflected in the polls, you might think, well, I don't want to waste my vote, as people say, and vote for them. Or alternatively, you could give a established party a higher number, which then makes other people say, well, then it's probably worth getting out of bed because the majority of people support that popular party. And I suppose it's to stop that kind of thing. And that's the danger with unregulated polling, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly why it's regulated in those countries, because they recognize that if you continuously tell the electorate that this particular party is growing and this one isn't, then eventually that is going to become a self-enforcing kind of truth. And there's no question, whatever result Action SA gets, it's going to be in spite of the many barriers to success that have been put in our way, including the polling industry that continuously represents us incorrectly. And we're very confident that when the announcement of the results takes place next Friday or Saturday, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be very embarrassed and you're going to have a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah, I must admit, I mean, one has to question some of the polling. I recently participated in a television debate which was in response to a poll that had Cope at 1.4%, and then you've got to say to yourself, surely that is just somebody writing numbers on a document.
Yeah, it has become a bit of a joke. I mean, I think Mark Data is the one that the ENCA has been producing. I think that's the one you're talking about.
Yeah.
They didn't even poll registered voters, I understand. They just polled generally the South African public. And they didn't actually test what a likely to turn out population would be. If you're not actually going to apply those filters to the people you're asking questions to, it really does become a bit of a joke in terms of the outcomes that are resulting.
Okay, so I think that after this election, I'd imagine there's going to be a few polls that shift, polls like as in POLES, that shift. Some of the architecture. South African politics are going to change for good after this election. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But despite the problem with polling, because to be fair, you guys have been a victim of it, but you're not the only ones that seem to be a victim of it. It's very different to what you're seeing on the ground, and just for people watching this, on just about every poll that I've seen, I haven't seen Action SA anywhere, I haven't seen Rise anywhere, I haven't seen Bossa anywhere, I haven't seen Chaluba anywhere, etc. These are people that have got structures and got people out there and have delivered, and in the case of Action SA, even have some of the track record associated with it. So that's part of the thing that starts giving these polls a bit of a problematic look to them. But despite that, do you see those polls that have that we've questioned affecting your vote?
Without any question. I mean, that's why we've made the noise we have about it, because at the end of the day, if you're going to have polling companies aided by the media repeating these polls and kind of, assaulting South Africans with this news day in and day out, there's only so much that a person can bat away and kind of treat critically when they eventually start to absorb that information. And I think from our point of view, it is hugely concerning, because when you've got polling companies which include current employees of political parties, it's open to manipulation.
Yeah,
it's open to changing election outcomes and influencing election outcomes in ways that are counter to our constitutional democracy, and it needs to be attended to. But at the end of the day, I think we've started a conversation in South Africa, which we are quite proud that we've got as far as we have, The South African National Editors Forum has released a communique to all members of the media after the fight we took, saying that you've got to be more circumspect when you're publishing polling. We've won the case in the Press Council that forced Report and other publications to confirm that it was a political party whose polling they published anonymously on the 10th of March. And at least now there's a conversation among South Africans that when these polls come out, questions are being asked about their methodology, about their sample size, and generally about things that just don't make sense in these polls.
Yeah, there has been a lot of that, and obviously there's many giveaways. One of them is that it almost goes lockstep with the person commissioning the poll as to what the results of that particular poll reflect.
You can look at some of these polls and you can almost see what the underlying narrative is. So the official opposition is growing, they say, which runs counter to every practical experience anyone's have in terms of where the DA is at. And the EFF and MK are becoming a massive threat to the left. The Swart Gevaar campaign, which we know the DA has been prolific in running. And then you see polling produced by organizations that are fundamentally aligned to the DA that produces outcomes aligned to that. I mean, you've got to kind of look at these things and start to ask some questions as to whether we're really getting the truth here.
We've also had some half-hearted attempts on the other side of the ledger that are showing the ANC doing particularly well. And
the IOL one, I think, was Iqbal's survey really shot the lights out. I think he put the EFF at 51% nationally or something like that. I mean, it really has been, like, at some points kind of quite comedic.
Well, in a way, some of the history of South Africa may counterbalance this in some way for this election, and that is that South Africa, I don't think, is going to be that much, I think the effect, even though it will be felt, will probably be, smaller than it would be in a more developed country with a let's hope.
Well, it is, but I think one of the things South Africans must be aware of is that the barriers to success, I won't say barriers to entry, because just to create a political party, it appears to be very easy, as a matter of fact. But for a political party to succeed, the barriers to entry are enormous. And, the realities of campaigning aside, because that's just, politics, you've got a political establishment that has set high limits in terms of what a party has to do in order to contest an election. So we've had to do that. They have rewarded themselves with 1.5 billion rand in taxpayer funding this year so that they can run elections while parties like ours have to raise every cent privately. They have the ICASA regulations that kick in so that if I have to get the media to come and cover a newsworthy, well-thought-out event that should be covered, the cameras have to be sent to one of those parties in Parliament that day. So, the odds are really stacked against new parties. And you've got to ask yourself, why in a country where people are rejecting incumbency, have incumbents found it so easy to create these barriers to success? It's all about making sure that they don't get kicked out.
Yeah, well, it's that wonderful thing called closing the gate behind you, isn't it? Right? Once you're in, you're pretty happy with the status quo, and you're pretty happy to lock that gate behind you.
Except South Africans aren't happy with the status quo.
We go over the wall, In South Africa, we've learned that gates don't stop people.
Yes.
So let's get onto the campaign, and I have remarked many times that Action SA, the one thing that Action SA has done to an admirable degree is set up structures. That has definitely been noticeable, certainly from what I can see. This is no Cope rerun, one man and a fax machine. This is a proper party. And you guys have been on the ground and you've been national, right? How's it looking,
Yeah, great. So I think from our point of view, you're absolutely right. And for the benefit of your viewers, there's a misconception about South African politics being won in interviews like this or on social media or those kind of platforms. And the reality is the majority of votes in South Africa are won on the doorsteps and street corners of communities and people. And if you don't have volunteers in those communities who are known to those voters and who are identifiable to those voters, who can go and talk to them about who you are, and represent Action SA to them in a way that matters in their particular circumstances, you aren't in the game. And that is why, from our point of view, I think Action SA stands head and shoulders above many of the new entrants into this election, because we have structures set up in 9 provinces, 8 metros, 52 of the 52 districts of our country. and now over 57% of the wards of South Africa, which is a considerable feat for a 3-year-old political party, because ultimately it's in activating those hundreds of thousands of people to go out there and campaign and be on the ground that Action SA is able to distinguish itself from many of the new parties and even some of the established parties. We look at a situation like this weekend where, the established parties will be having rallies and spending tens of millions of rands on those rallies, busing people into venues, etc. Action SA is literally going to be having thousands of rallies across the country on Saturday and Sunday, and in the communities where those people will be able to see us in the streets and not just on their TVs. And I think that is quite a big difference between us and other political parties. But, it's a continued thing. It's a difficult job to set up structures across a country as big and as rural as parts of South Africa are. But what we are seeing is that certainly some provinces are revealing more potential than others. And I think that we are going to make breakthroughs in places that are going to surprise people, including provinces which, by the way, are completely off the map in the polling discussion in South Africa. So no one is really polling what's happening in the Eastern Cape, the Northern Cape, for example. And these are places that we are detecting some quite considerable shifts.
Yeah. Now, we know you, with your introduction in 2021, where you made quite good headway in the metros here up in Gauteng. And one would expect that to carry through in Gauteng. So let's talk about some of those other provinces, because, as you say, it's very hard to get any information. You hear that, ANC and the people are almost talking as if there's no opposition in the Eastern Cape.
Yeah.
Right? Tell me what the state of play is in the Eastern Cape.
Well, it's interesting, you see, because, people are right on one level. I mean, the ANC has not lost a single percentage point in the Eastern Cape since 2009. They have been seemingly bulletproof there. But what we have been experiencing on the ground under the leadership of people like Athol Trollip, who I think have an incredible track record and have set up an amazing team of people there, is that we are genuinely producing support that's never been had before. And I listen to someone like Athol say to me, Michael, I was the leader of the DA in the Eastern Cape for all those years. And I'm launching branches under Action SA in 1 year that I couldn't have launched in 20, in places like Ngobo and Bazana and very rural parts of the Eastern Cape. So certainly, I think, what you will see in provinces like the Eastern Cape is there's an older demographic of voters, many of whom are very stuck in their ways politically. And I think because of their experiences in the past, but certainly among a younger demographic that is growing in number and growing in its anger, there's a lot of support being picked up in provinces like the Eastern Cape. And I think we can expect a considerable decrease in the ANC in that province for the first time.
So do you anticipate getting votes at the expense of the ANC in the Eastern Cape?
Yes, most certainly. We will unquestionably get votes at the expense of the ANC in the Eastern Cape and in all the provinces, for what it's worth. But, the unique and defining feature of Action SA is we get votes from everyone. And we absolutely apologize to no one about it, because at the end of the day, if you are a rational center party filling the vacuum of a vacated rational middle in South Africa, people are going to come from all directions. And that's why we don't have to work hard to produce a diverse image in our party. Our party is diverse at a grassroots level. If you go back to those 2021 results, we got 21% of the vote in Soweto and 25% in this community here in Parkhurst, where we are right now. And that's genuine grassroots diversity that we are very proud of. And I think a lot of South Africans increasingly are looking for a party who can bring them together in the rational center and be a political home for them.
And some of the other areas, Northern Cape, Free State?
Yeah, I mean, the Northern Cape, I think, is particularly going to shock people. We've got an incredible team of people there. It's way off the radar of the Northern Cape because it's only 3 or 4% of the national voters roll, and people don't ever focus enough on what's going on there. But I mean, I'll give you an example with a place like Kimberley, which already constitutes a very big part of the entire province. There are 33 wards in the metro or in the municipality of Solplaiki, they call it. We have branches in every one of those 33 wards, and they are active and they are vibrant and they are strong. So I think the Northern Cape is particularly going to shock people. And What's interesting about it is the big discussions around KZN and Gauteng, understandably. But, with the Northern Cape and the strong possibility that the ANC loses a majority, with the fact that the ANC won't come back in the Western Cape anytime soon, and with a province like the Free State that you correctly reference has always been hanging in the balance with a very narrow ANC majority before, you start to have a dynamic where you can now have a majority of provinces that fall outside of ANC control. And I mean, for the benefit of the viewers, constitutionally, that means the National Council of Provinces, our higher House of Parliament, can actually begin to veto legislation produced by the National Assembly that should be vetoed.
Because there's as somebody that admittedly, I keep an eye on these things quite closely, but you don't know the inner workings. It seems to be quite a strange situation in the Northern Cape and the Free State. Pick those two specifically, where the ANC majority is falling, but there doesn't seem to be anybody to date that has made a significant grab of the vote.
Without any question. And I think that's not just those two provinces, it's others as well.
Limpopo.
Limpopo was the first province I was actually going to mention to you. Because I think there are lots of people who have lost faith in the establishment. And the only new political party that they have had in the last 10, 15 years worth any kind of reference of any kind was been the EFF. And I think the EFF's radicalism and their nature tends to polarize people, and the people who like them really like them, and that's one thing. But there's a whole large chunk of people who find them extreme and anarchic and chaotic. And at the end of the day, they're not interested in that. And I think Action SA emerging when we have now in those provinces has presented an option that really hasn't been on the table for them for a long time. And that's why we're picking up quite a big uptake in those places.
The other two provinces, before we get into the biggies, that, is Northwest, which seems almost as enigmatic as Eastern Cape, and Mpumalanga, which seems to be very close to the KZN in the way it behaves.
Yeah. No, I think that is so. I think the Northwest, we're expecting good results. If you look at what's arisen under the leadership of General Kwena Mangope as our provincial chairperson in the Northwest, and what the legacy of that name means to many people who recall in the early 90s when the Northwest and places like Rustenburg were some of the most fastest growing towns in the world, not even in South Africa. It is the case that these are places where we can expect good results, and a lot of people are going to find resonance with the Action SA offer. In Mpumalanga, certainly it's a very difficult province, probably one of the most difficult provinces to crack. And there obviously appears to be an ethnic kind of connection to KZN. It probably explains why MK appears to have had some uptake there. But at the same time, Action SA is patient. The work of gaining the trust of the South African people doesn't end on the 29th of May. In fact, someone pointed out a rather scary thought that we're actually only 2 years away from the next local government election already. It was a bit soon for me to hear that, if I'm honest. But, we're in this game long term. And even if there are people who go to the polls and vote for another party, we know they hold us in high regard.
Yes.
And we can work to build their trust and earn their vote over time.
Yeah. And then, of course, we get to the three big provinces in terms of number of voters or economic importance, where there's mass contestation.
Yes.
Right. And we start off with the Western Cape, where there's a proper bun fight going on. And, the DA's majority, which they've had for the last couple of election cycles, is under serious threat. Yeah. We see that in the by-elections. We see that writ large, we see it sometimes by the behavior of the DA, where they spent a lot of time, energy, and political capital telling smaller parties not to campaign there, which is a strange election strategy. But we set them aside and we ask our Action SA, you guys have been down there. In fact, we have interviewed your potential head of the Western Cape here. And, how's that going?
Good. I think the Western Cape is an interesting dynamic because we are picking up support, both in DA communities, but also very neglected ANC communities. The kind of places like Khayelitsha and Langa, we have come to realize are voters who are so desperate for a political home because they are underserviced communities, without any question. There are real service delivery challenges that they don't find expression in terms of the DA. But the ANC in opposition is probably one of the most feeble things in South African politics, because when the taps of patronage and networks and jobs get turned off, I mean, it really does wither on the vine. And we are finding communities there where we have been growing prodigiously at the expense of the ANC as well. The work in the so-called coloured communities of the Western Cape has gone well. I think it's going to be a very contested environment. The Patriotic Alliance certainly has thrown down the gauntlet in those communities. But at the end of the day, we see a scenario where the DA will probably lose its majority in the Western Cape, but narrowly so, and they will be in the need of coalition partners. And I think this is where Action SA's campaign to the people of the Western Cape is to say that, the Western Cape can be better run. There are some blind spots that are clear in that province, and we don't think a province should benchmark itself against the ANC. I think that's benchmarking against the worst case scenario. But that actually some coalition partners to ensure that the arrogance of majority rule does not creep into the Western Cape to the extent that we have begun to see would be a good thing for the people of that province.
Yeah, so but it's encouraging to hear that you're making some strides, because obviously we see the Patriotic Alliance doing a very, very tactically astute campaigning, going after that coloured vote. But one would imagine that it has limited resonance amongst the black community within the Western Cape.
Yeah, I think so, included even in the coloured communities, actually. I think one of the things the PA has done very cleverly is they have built up a narrative of momentum that not necessarily exists.
Right.
So what they will do is they'll go in and they will encourage a person to resign. Let's be polite and use the word encourage. And then they will encourage the candidates of the DA to drop their candidacy after the deadline for filing, so that the DA is not contesting in that ward at all. And then they'll win the ward, and then they will tell South Africans that this is another ward that they've won and this is more momentum that they can claim. The point is, when you're contesting 4,468 wards all at one time, you can't do that.
Yes.
And you're not going to be able to win votes that kind of way. And what really rapidly separates, the serious parties from the not so serious parties in a national election is how they can actually string it together when it's all happening at once. Mm-hmm. Because when those numbers start coming in from all around the country, what you got in this little pocket there and that little pocket there gets watered down very quickly.
Yeah, I've made this point over here because we have discussed by-elections a lot. We've had Wayne Sussman here a few times. We've had a few other analysts, and it's something to watch. But by-elections give you a good steer in certain respects, but in other respects they give you a bum steer, and that is because in some cases you're talking about 1,000 voters, or the numbers are minuscule. It's easy to say. There was the one ward where the MK party got 28%, and I think it was less than 200 votes.
Yeah.
So it does. One has to be careful.
Well, that's exactly it. And I mean, if you look at a lot of around what the kind of enigma of MK has been presented to the South African people, it's really about two things. It's about, firstly, polling, which you and I have spoken about already. And I think we've got to understand there are, political interests and economic interests in our country in creating a fear of the left and, kind of radical growth of a party like MK. But at the same time, it's also the fact that they've been doing well in by-elections, which when you interrogate, these are very small wards, numbers-wise, in the north of KZN, with a few hundred voters in total on the voters' roll. Mm. And to do very well in one of those wards at one time and one day is one thing. But when you have to do so across all of those wards at one time in KZN, it's an entirely different prospect.
Yeah. And of course, they do have the added appeal of the Jacob Zuma name, which resonates in those particular small areas. Which brings us to KZN, where you guys have been very active. It seems like a province that where the sort of sands have shifted completely from where they were, 2 months ago. What do you think Action SA impact in KZN is going to be? Because there is little doubt that is heading towards serious contested and coalition arrangement.
So, I mean, if you look at the dynamic in KZN, what makes it different from any other province is when you are going into communities to win votes, particularly from historically ANC or IFP communities, those votes are now being contested by the ANC, the IFP, MK and the EFF. And I don't think there's any other province that you can really say that you have that 5-way contestation for votes that we have entered in the KZN environment there. And it's one of those provinces where I think we look at it again in terms of the long term. There may well be voters who go to the polls and vote for political parties despite having a certain affinity towards Action SA, and we will work over time to win those votes. But, we expect a strong result in KZN, particularly on the back of the work we've been doing in eThekwini. Our KZN provincial leader, Zwakele Mwango, has been leading a fight in eThekwini Council on behalf of the residents that I think, quite frankly, we've become the unofficial opposition. We get asked all the time, where the hell is the DA in eThekwini? And that is because we are the ones that are taking the city to court on the sewage crisis that has reduced the tourist numbers per year from 8 million to 800,000. Which is an absolute catastrophe. We are the ones taking the South Coast Ugu district to court over their inability to provide water to the people of that province for sometimes as long as 9 years since people last saw a drop of water. And a lot of people in those communities are saying, why is it that a 3-year-old political party that doesn't have a cent of state funding, that's not even yet represented in Parliament, is taking on these battles on our behalf when the so-called political establishment has been fast asleep? And I think that's going to pay dividends for us in KZN, and I really tip my hat to the leadership there who've worked tirelessly to make that happen.
So do you think that you will have something to say come post-election day in KZN?
Absolutely. I certainly think it's going to be a place where we develop a strong footprint. But I think in many cases, it's going to be a footprint that we're going to develop to 2026. The growth of a political party is not linear in that regard, and I think contesting a national election like this when you are yet to be resourced by the state like your competitors, you really have to get a foot in the door, and a respectable foot in the door, which we anticipate we will. And the growth path, I think, towards 2026 is what's really going to take off.
Yeah. Now, which leaves us with Gauteng, which is obviously up for grabs. I've coined the phrase and going to use it a lot. We've seen the Lesothification of elections in 2024. Whether it's legal or illegal, I think that's for the courts to decide in time. But we've got ANC head in Gauteng, Panyaza Lesufi, literally just opening up the vaults and allowing and just flat out buying votes.
Yeah.
With things that I presume are, in the fullness of time, going to be found to be immoral at least, but maybe illegal at best. But it is a province that you do already have a footprint on local level. And I'd imagine that is where you are expecting a return.
Without any question. I think before we go any further, the other dynamic about the Lesothification, I think is the word used, a great word, by the way, is that I think the return on investment for the residents is going to prove to be poor. And there's going to be long-term contractual commitments to which the people of this province will now be bound in perpetuity, even when he's gone. And please let me repeat that, even when he is gone after these elections next week. And I think that's really going to be his legacy, which is hugely frustrating. But certainly from our point of view, yes, this is a province where we contested 3 of the 9 municipalities in 2021, the 3 metros. We got around 10 or 11% of the vote. We have been working very hard since then. We have 78 councillors already elected in the local government elections in those 3 places. So we're very confident that we will produce a great result here. In fact, if anything, what we've been saying to the people of Gauteng is that they have witnessed the very worst of coalition government in this province. They've seen coalitions of convenience of the ANC and EFF, often with these puppet mayors who really, ought not to be running even the smallest of places, much less the metros of our economic hub of the country. But at the same time, they've also seen coalitions led by the DA that have fallen apart or that haven't been pursued in Joburg right now, for example, or that have experienced the instability that we've seen in Tshwane. And I think in many ways, the campaign that has really resonated with a lot of people in Gauteng is, what we have emblazoned on our posters of late, which is let action lead. They've seen the first way, they've seen the second way, neither have worked well for them. Let's try a different way because, I mentioned to you off camera for the benefit of your listeners that we've entered an era of coalition. And actually, coalition is a team sport. And you get some people who are excellent individual players in their own respective sports. But in the world of a team environment, I think Action SA is absolutely the right captain to lead that team, bring about stability, deliver services, and ensure that people don't have to have the revolving door of political leadership that has characterized the last few years.
So then that all translates into a national picture which includes members of parliament. It includes, for starters, I know that you're not here to analyze other parties, but do you see within your calculations the ANC slipping below the majority level?
Yes, most certainly. I think the ANC, I will believe, will not just be below a majority. I think they'll be below 45. Mm-hmm. I think they're going to struggle to turn people out and to animate them. And I think in that way, people underestimate that in 2019, there was the benefit of the enthusiasm South Africans very wrongly had for Cyril Ramaphosa, but nonetheless had. That did turn people out to the polls in numbers that I just don't think realistically they're going to be able to produce in this election. So I do think they are going to struggle, and we are going to be entering an era of national coalition.
And you mentioned, moving on from coalition, do you think, because you've been involved in some of the worst aspects of coalitions, right? You've been through the mill, both in your former role when you were chief of staff for Herman Mashaba, when he was mayor of Johannesburg, in a very the first of the major coalitions, and now in the post 2021 era in Gauteng, where we've had coalition issues. Tell the poor, long-suffering voter out there that's watching us, do we expect this to a similar kind of performance at national level, or what is your outlook for coalitions post the election?
At a national level, it's very difficult to say, and allow me just to explain what I mean by that. So I think nationally the numbers are likely to point towards a possibility of a minority coalition government, which people don't realize is entirely a possibility, because when we elect office bearers like a president or a speaker, it's rounds of voting, where if no majority is won, the weakest candidate falls off, and there's another round of voting, a bit like the French presidential system. And what that means is that party that falls off must now reallocate their support to one of the candidates left. And of course, you're very likely to end up with a scenario of a multi-party charter candidate versus an ANC candidate. Because whatever one's perspectives of the multi-party charter are, it is the biggest voting bloc outside of the ANC in the history of democratic South Africa. And again, with the surprises that I predict next Wednesday, it's going to be bigger than people realize. And you could very easily have a minority government that has to reach across the aisle on an issue-by-issue basis with some humility, which has been absent up until now in the coalition picture, and work to achieve majorities across key areas, and probably recognize that a stability would kick in, because people know politically that importing the local government experience in the national government is not only extraordinarily bad for our economic prospects as a country, but it's not something the South African people are going to tolerate or enjoy.
Yeah.
But if you go beyond that, I think the real question there lies on whether the multi-party charter can stick together. And we have expressed ourselves, as I will now, unequivocally, that we are profoundly disappointed that some of our partners have begun to flip-flop on the question of their plans with the ANC. When we came together in August last year, the multi-party charter agreement produced a clause that said no party in this arrangement will entertain working relationships with the ANC, full stop. you'll appreciate the word entertain is very broad. It's designed to make sure that there's literally no option for it on the table. And I know that because we introduced that clause. And we did so because before the charter came about, the DA and many of its leaders had talked about possible coalition with the ANC since 2019, as a matter of fact. And we wanted that assurance that what we weren't going to see is Action SA becoming complicit in a project of defrauding the South African people. A project that goes out and says to the South African people, we represent change, only then for that votes to go in the direction of change to be used to continue the tenure of the political party from which we need change. And from that point of view, we've been very disappointed by the statements by the DA and the IFP. We think that they have let people down. And we think that those parties are going to have to come clean before the election or face the consequences of being ambiguous on the question of the ANC. And just for your listeners' benefit, we don't adopt this position because we hate the ANC or that any of this is petty. We hate what their leaders have done to South Africa. And in real terms, the idea that a small party like the DA could be in coalition with a big party like the ANC and affect real reforms, it's absolute fantasy.
Yeah.
You've got to understand that the nature of governments is that big parties generally dictate the pace. The nature of governments, especially an ANC government, is that the line between party and state has been so eroded over so many decades that you can put, DA, MP, what in charge of a portfolio. All the people who work in that department ultimately know that they get instructions from your boss, the president. And in real terms, I think the idea that you can fight corruption or cater deployment from within the beast is just science fiction, and it's insane.
I think it was put best in one of our discussions here, where in fact it was with Jan Machanwa from Citizens, who put it quite well, and I think people would do well to understand. There is no way for renewal or reform within the ANC or the EFF, which is structured on the same basis, purely because they, in order to survive as an entity, they have to have corruption. Because you've got 2,000 people on your books, but you can only accommodate 1,000 within your government structures. Therefore, you've got to pay the other 1,000, and the way to do it is through tenders or jobs at SOEs or cadre deployment in its worst terms. Both of those organizations have to have corruption in order to survive, and I think people must understand that. It's impossible. It's not just, they couldn't stamp it out even if they wanted to. The only way to do it is to kind of eradicate them.
Well, I mean, let's deal with this practically, right? Because the world of government is not theoretical, it's not academic, it's a very practical environment. Practically, the president of the ANC, who was elected on the promise of renewal, has failed to renew the ANC. Why would the leader of another smaller political party think they're going to do what Cyril Ramaphosa has failed to do? They're not going to be able to reform the ANC if he has failed. But more importantly, let's talk practically. You have delivered a campaign where you say we're going to fight corruption. You sit down in your first cabinet meeting, and many of the people who should be investigated for corruption are sitting there around the table. How serious is that fight against corruption going to be? The same party I mentioned is in court. The DA is in court with the ANC over cadre deployment. It's an important case. It's a good case that they're trying. But then they go into government with the same ANC who passed the policy of cadre deployment at an internal elective conference in the early 2000s. It's not going to be reversed by a coalition partner. And the idea that these kind of reforms can be won from within, I think it's really just a ruse for people who appear to be power hungry.
Right. Now, let's take it back to Action SA, and let's take it to the election, 29th of May. We wake up, I presume, 1st of June, all the results are in. The pollsters have got egg on their face, right? Because the results show Action SA with...
Oh, you're looking for a number, are you?
I'll give you a prediction or a comment or something like that. What's fair to ask you on that?
We try to avoid that at all costs. What I will say to you is this. If you look at first-time political parties that have tried to contest in the political environment nationally, the best result that I think has been achieved before was about 6% by the EFF, and similarly by COPE, I think, in 2009. I think Action SA can go north of that, and I think we will. But at the end of the day, we're not going to go in there and make predictions at this point. We're going to go in there and work as hard as we can to maximize that vote and to turn as many undecided voters as we can towards us in the last week.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Action SA has been steadfast in their principles. They have been here many times. We've heard from them. We see their manifesto. Mike, there was an interesting discussion I had the other day where we put the question to quite an esteemed panel in an event that we did, saying which party, we were bemoaning the state of the economy, and we said, well, which party would best represent, has best represented or spoken about the economy? And it was frightening that the panel could not come up with one party name, after we've gone into great detail about the woes being largely economic, which they are, and that starts the whole ball rolling. And I made a suggestion that perhaps Action SA is about the only party that I've heard that talks about the economy with some kind of common sense, and I will hold that firm. I haven't seen another party that talks about the economy with some kind of understanding and manifesto. So certainly from a pro-business point of view, Action SA, deserve a consideration. To everybody out there on all sides of the electoral landscape, Action SA could very well be the consideration for this party, for this election. And we have heard from many people, you need to make that vote. You need to think very carefully about who you vote for. And perhaps Action SA is a consideration. Michael Beaumont, thank you for coming through. To everybody that watched us, go and support Pace Car Rental. Support State of the Nation by subscribing to the channel. And good luck on election day.